So hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Ryan Melsom, and I'm the Manager of Qualifications and Secretary to the Canadian Engineering Qualifications Board, or the CEQB, as I'll often refer to them. I'll be your moderator for today's session on empowering Indigenous voices in engineering, guidance for meaningful consultation and engagement. So to begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous people on the lands that I'm on today, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Omama Winenawag people. I'd also like to acknowledge the land where I come from, to Kamloops Te Shiquapam, and the many wonderful things that it gave me while I was growing up there. I hope that you too will take a moment to think of the lands where you are and the many ways in which the land sustains and nurtures us. Doing so helps us reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to one another, and it helps strengthen relationships between non-Indigenous and Indigenous people. And as we learned, developing this guideline, it is all about relationships. On behalf of Engineers Canada, I want to acknowledge the ancestral and unceded land of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people across the country. It's a good time to come together to discuss meaningful ways to engage with and learn from one another. We can do this to better understand each other's truths and to continually seek out paths towards sincere and meaningful reconciliation. Today, we're joined by an amazing panel of speakers from across Canada, each of whom played a significant role in developing the CEQB guideline on Indigenous consultation and engagement. So thank you all for joining us today and for your contributions to this guideline's development. To begin then, I'd like to start by getting to know our speakers a little bit. Elder Norman Mead, I'll ask you to go first. I want to thank you very much for your many contributions and for joining us today. So if you wouldn't mind saying a few words about yourself, we can start there.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. It's good to see you all. Yeah, I grew up here in Manitoba, just north of Winnipeg, a couple hours north, Manigotaugan. I grew up as a Métis lad and Métis man, part of the Red River settlement, but my grandmothers were from the north and of Manitoba, and I spent my entire young life in Manigotaugan, got some of my schooling there, and then went on after that to join the province of Manitoba as a civil servant, and I now work as an elder at the University of Manitoba, and I've been there. I'm there, and I just signed my 9th contract just the other day. So 9 years I've been there, and if I'd have went as a student for 9 years, I'd have been a doctor or something now, but I'm not. So I that's who I am, and I enjoyed my work here with you on doing some of the, putting together of this document and this, what we're working at here in way of bringing the Indigenous thought and Indigenous practice into engineering in some way. And I'll talk a little more about that in a bit. But yeah, that's who I am, and it's nice to see each and every one of you.
It's nice to see you too. It's been too long. Okay, next we have Connor Shue, who is a liaison from the Indigenous Advisory Committee to the CEQB Practice Committee, and who was a voting member on the final decisions on the guideline. So Connor.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Connor. I'm a Métis engineer living in Mohkinstsis, also Calgary, Alberta, which is on the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy and also a Region 3 Métis Nation. And as Ryan said, I'm a member of the Engineers Canada Indigenous Advisory Committee. And yeah, once again, here as a representative, trying to bring forth that voice. Professionally, I specialize in renewable energy, and I'm a professional engineer here in Calgary. I'll leave it at that for now. We'll get on with the show.
Super. Thanks, Connor. Okay, Danilo. Danilo and our next guest as well, Gail Frank, we're both members of the Urban Systems team, which you can see from the lovely branded background there. And we're the project consultants for the project as we proceeded. So Danilo, if you wouldn't mind.
Ani Kenawea, Danilo and Indigenous. Hello, everyone. My name is Danilo. As Ryan said, I'm one of the co-leaders of the guideline development with Urban Systems, and based out of based out of Vancouver, which is the traditional ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. Very honored to be here today, and also very honored to have been a part of this guideline process. Very formative experience for myself, and I'm really happy to see it released and excited to see where it goes.
Me too. Okay, Gail.
Waitap Gail Frankensquest, Hoishinistat Lehman Stequin. My name is Gail Frank, and I'm from the Smiling People of Bridge River, which is by Lillooet, BC. I am currently in Tecumseh, and I work out of our Kamloops branch for urban systems. I'm currently leading our Truth and Reconciliation practice as the Senior Advisor for Indigenous Relations and Truth and Reconciliation. I am very grateful to be a part of this project, and it was my most favorite project at the time. So I am so glad that it's rolling out, and I'm really looking forward to the feedback that we receive. Fiction.
Thank you so much, Gail. And last but not least, Sam Inchassi.
Well, thank you, Ryan, and great to see everyone. My name is Sam Inchassi. I'm actually Vice Chair of the Canadian Engineering Qualifications Board and the Practice Committee Chair. I was very honored to be part of this project as well, and to learn a lot on this journey from such esteemed panel members. So I wanted to say hello for everyone, and I'm located out of Southern Ontario. I live in Milton, Ontario, and work out of the town of Oakville. Thanks again, Ryan. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, so I'd like to just provide a little bit of background about the project before we jump into some questions and some speaking with our panelists. For those of you unfamiliar with Engineers Canada, it's the National Association of the 12 provincial and territorial engineering regulators. So the organization offers numerous supports to improve engineering regulation and practice in Canada. The vision of Engineers Canada is advancing Canadian engineering through national collaboration. The guideline that we'll be discussing today is definitely the result of a nationwide collaboration. It was originally proposed by the Indigenous Advisory Committee of Engineers Canada, which is made up primarily of Indigenous engineers. It grew out of a recognition that there are many cases historically and still into the present where the engineering profession has failed to protect the Indigenous public and thereby failed in its core ethical responsibilities. This has damaged both trust in and access to engineering by Indigenous people. The guidelines development was assigned to the Canadian Engineering Qualifications Board in no small part because this group is geographically representative and made up of engineering leaders from numerous sectors and walks of life. One thing that was very clear throughout the project is that a respectful relationship between the profession and Indigenous people and communities is critical for the future of engineering in Canada. We recognize that this work represents a small step in a history with far too many missteps, but we hope that it can start conversations that will continue to grow and build towards a better future. So as I mentioned, throughout the guidelines development, the CEQB hosted a series of regional and national gatherings to bring together perspectives. And during these, we had the incredible honor of receiving blessings and wisdom from Elder Norman Mead. His wisdom helped everyone better understand where this work fit into the wider world. So Elder Norman, then, as our guest of honor, I would like to start with you. First of all, would you mind sharing your perspective on the importance of including Indigenous perspectives in engineering work?
Yes, sure. When we think of collaboration on a national scale, national level, we have to start somewhere with collaboration. And it really starts with, I call it the 2 C's before collaboration. I call it the consultation or the communications part, and then the cooperation part, which is part of the process. And we can achieve collaboration so long as we get the first 2 right and in order. So where do we start? Well, as engineers or as anyone out there working in the Indigenous community, we have to start with those that we are working for and working with, the Indigenous folks, the ones that have lived there for centuries. That's where we start. And of course, when we talk about all our relations, We have to understand that all of our relations doesn't mean just our relationship with Indigenous leaders and Indigenous people in that community. It means Indigenous thought or Indigenous thinking means all of our relations with everything that is on that land. I sometimes refer to it as the garden because many times we think of our gardens this time of the year, harvest season, we think about what our garden produces for us, right? And we take care of it. And whenever we go in to do work with, with communities, we ought to be in the thought of we have to treat Mother Earth. That in order for her to look after us, we have to look after her. That means to look after the water, to look after the earth itself, to look after the forest, to look after the air that we all need in our lungs, and to look after the heartbeat itself of Mother Earth. If it means sounding a drum like we do often, that's what it means. And as a Métis man, I came to realize this in working in my community at Manawgataugan. Whenever we were asked to have needing someone to come and help us, and I can remember our very first time meeting the first engineer that came to work with us, and he was on step 10 and we were on step 0 or step 1, and we had to bring that 0 and that 10 closer together. And we did this by way of talking with him about, helping him to understand who we were as Métis and First Nations people on that land, if he was going to help us. Otherwise, we were going to stay distant, never really consulting with us, never really cooperating with us, and never really achieving collaboration, if you will. But that came about. But it wasn't easy to bring that about. His language, I say language, was different than our language. And we had to even just to understand what he was talking about, he had to come down to our level and help us bring us up to his level. Because, engineers talk pretty high level English even, right? And we weren't talking Ojibwe, which is Ojibwe speaking territory in that part of Manitoba. But it wasn't just the different in a language barrier meaning a language. It was just the language that we use in everyday lingo. We talk about colonialism, and if we ever want to bring sort of an indigenized colonial thought, we have to know that we use colonial language every day and we don't even realize it. I use it at the university where I work, and I think we all use it, and we're not even sure that we're using it, or we don't mean to use it in a negative way, but we do. Colonial language is what I call it. We have to somehow indigenize that language. Yeah. So I think we can do that, but it's going to take time, and it's going to take effort, and it's going to take understanding on the part of Indigenous folks and those that come to help and assist, such as engineers. Just one more thing I will say about this, and that is this: in my work as a miner, when I was a young man, I worked in a mine, and we never ever got to talk to the engineers. The planning was done by management of the mine and the engineers. We would see them underground, but we never got to talk to them. We never got to sit at the same table as them to talk about plans of what we were doing on the work site. And so I think now we have to kind of bridge that and bridge that gap and say, well, we need our producers a little bit closer to where decisions are made, boardrooms, with the engineers that we get to work with and get to know over time. And I think we can bridge that by doing what we're doing. Yeah, Miigwech.
Thank you. Thank you, Elder Norman. Just thinking about that question, of this engineer coming into the community and, trying to find some kind of level. And I would say, from his perspective, he was probably learning a lot too at that time and trying to get up to the community's level. So I was wondering if you could talk about some of the challenges of that process. How did you go about that? How did you go about building some kind of mutual recognition, understanding, some kind of ground for collaboration there?
Yeah, well, I say it took some time. It took a number of meetings with him. Yeah. And what we were building was, we were building a curling rink, and we were using material right from our sawmill. And we didn't have a planer to plane our lumber, to grade our lumber. We had no such thing. But so we had to use rough lumber that came off of the mill. And of course, that a 2x4 is a real 2x4. It's not a 1.5 by 3.5. It's a real 2x4. And so we said, well, our 2x4 is a lot stronger than one you're talking about, the graded lumber for our long roof on that curling rink. And of course, it took a long time to convince him that our material, although it wasn't graded material, but he had to put a stamp of approval on it, and we knew that. And it just took a lot of time and effort for us not to give up on what we were wanting to do, and for him to come a little bit down to, let's say 5, and instead of us having to move from 0 to 10, that he would come down from 10 to 5 or 4 even, or 6, somewhere in that mid-range. And so we were able to do that, and we accomplished that. And that building still stands today, by the way. Now I'm going back 50 years. So his building that he put his stamp of approval on is still up, still standing.
Wow. Okay, so then I guess just taking sort of like a step back, and thinking kind of overall, what would I was wondering if you could just talk a little about the significance of respectful and meaningful engagement in engineering. And why is that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, whenever we talk about anything that's meaningful, we have to understand that meaningful means that it fits the needs of everyone, all of our relations that we have. It doesn't just serve the purpose for the company officials or the engineers, or it also has to serve the purpose and meet the requirements and the thought of our indigenous people as well. And really what it means when we think about that relationship, that benefits have to accrue to everyone. If they accrue to the company, they should also accrue to the folks that live and give up their resources that they're giving up in order to have a project take form. And of course, that we call upon our engineers, the ones that are sort of the umbrella, if you will, the go-between between the community and company officials. Let's say, we need them to be respectful of both sides. And I know that often engineers now, Indigenous engineers, and I say that not because most of you are Indigenous, but because they understand better that what the relationship is when we talk about all of our relations, which means the relationship with, like I said, with water, forest, with mineral and so on, that it's all encompassing. But our Indigenous thought, where we're coming from as Indigenous folks, when you understand that relationship, how important it is to everyone. And at the end of the day, as we know, once the project is complete and once profits start accruing, whether it's profits in way of money or whatever it might be, that the good things that we end up with is that we all share in those profits. And that's where the cooperation comes in, that we cooperate in that way so that we share the benefits one with another. It doesn't just all belong to company. It doesn't all belong to First Nations or it belongs to all parties involved. And I think that's really respectful engagement, if you will. And engagement has to start at the beginning, and it's got to go through to the finished product.
Yeah.
You can't say, let's engage the community at the beginning and not engage them throughout the development of the project. It's got to be an ongoing thing, an ongoing process. And engineers know that. They know that it's an ongoing process. You don't come in and say, well, we consulted with the First Nations folks and now we're ready to go and we can do whatever we want. That isn't the way it works. Yeah. They have to be engaged at all phases of the project. We can't get midway through and say, well, let's just drop the engagement or the respect that we have for for our relations, all of our relations in the community. That would be the worst thing to do. The best thing to do would be to keep it nice and strong and keep that line of communication open, have the consultation that we talk about, see through the project through to its entire life. And collaboration will only prove to be useful, and we'll only know that we achieved collaboration if at the end of the day, at the end of the project, we say, well, you know, we've collaborated well, we have done well. Now we will share in the benefits and you know, to each one involved.
Mhm.
And I think for me as an Indigenous person, as an old as an elder now, I think that's what I would encourage for any project, any size project, whether it's a curling rink building or whether it's a mining project or whether it's some other project, you know, a pipeline. We have to bring them, those Indigenous folks into the room, and we have to allow them to sit in the room.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that one thing that occurred to me as we were going throughout this process, and I was able to sort of participate and observe a lot of it, is that what's traditionally thought of as consultation is a very, very small part, and it is embedded within relationships, and those relationships must last, and they need to be they're really the important part. Consultation goes well or better when there's trust, when relationships have been built, and so yeah, that was something that came up in a number of ways for me throughout the process. And you know, I'm very happy again, just, you know, speaking of relationships, that everybody, you know, was able to jump on this call today and talk a little more about the work that everybody collaborated on. So thank you, Elder Norman. Okay, so as I guess we'll shift to another question here for another one of our panelists. So as I noted earlier, you know, the guideline is a product of the Canadian Engineering Qualifications Board, which is a board of, or a committee of Engineers Canada. And guidelines such as this one provide support to help engineers improve their practices and better support the public that they serve. So Sam, if I can turn to you now, as chair of the CEQB practice committee, which really drove this work, I'm wondering if you could talk a little more about the purpose of the guideline from the CEQB's perspective.
Thank you, Ryan. I guess the purpose of this guideline really is to provide a meaningful and an actual useful and practical tool that engineers and engineering firms can use, I guess, when we work with our Indigenous communities to develop engineering projects. So that's really what it's about.
Mm-hmm. And so what then motivated the QB to work on this guideline now? I mean, we heard a little bit about the background and, you know, the Indigenous Advisory Committee, but why was this work important to undertake at this moment?
Well, as you know, Ryan, engineers play a very critical role in serving our society. So it is through the application of engineering principles that we as engineers really try to improve our communities and ensure that we protect the public interest. And that is of paramount importance. So in order to protect the public, engineers need to represent the Canadian population and understand how best to engage with a variety of communities. As such, and as you mentioned, Engineers Canada's board tasks the organization and its volunteers with improving Indigenous access to engineering and with the development of a guideline on how engineers and engineering firms can meaningfully consult and engage Indigenous communities with ongoing development of engineering projects. Again, it's important to note that looking back at history, there's been a lot of engineering projects that really failed to adequately serve our Indigenous people and their communities. And therefore, they also failed in the mandate to protect the public. So I would say, given the commitments by, again, engineering regulators, actually many, who support the Truth and Reconciliation, and given that Engineers Canada's board's decision to address issues surrounding engineering relationship and with Indigenous peoples and communities, the development of this guideline on Indigenous consultation and engagement was tasked to CEQB and delivered by the practice committee. Urban Systems, I have to say, did an amazing job in creating this guideline. So thank you, both Danilo and Gail.
Thanks, Sam. So I guess I get just one sort of more general question. I think you've touched on a lot of this through your comments already, but you know, from your point of view, why was it important to establish a guideline focusing on Indigenous engagement and consultation? You know, there's lots of, you know, technical possibilities or other ways to approach this project. Why, you know, consultation and engagement in engineering?
Well, again, there's a definite desire, I guess, to strengthen relationships.
Mhm.
Make sure that we contribute to improving communities and community outcomes, and share in collective healing. So the relationship building, which was mentioned once before, really goes beyond this engineering projects. The content of the guideline itself and the conversations that we went through and continue to go through really will help all users to practice engagement with humility and empathy. So our Indigenous communities and engineering stakeholders really will use this guideline as a foundation, hopefully, for a future individualized engagement process and approach.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you.
Now I'm going to turn the camera to my old friends, Danilo and Gail. We did a lot of work on this one together, and it was such a pleasure the entire time working with both of you. So, so in creating the guideline then, Engineers Canada was hoping to develop a resource and an approach that would help strengthen relationships with Indigenous communities. But there was also an acknowledgement that we did not have the expertise or network to undertake this work on our own, and that's where you lovely folks came in. So as a critical part of this process then, we really needed to seek out knowledgeable practitioners and to invite guidance and insight from Indigenous communities and, folks that could, facilitate that guidance and insight. So through a proposal process then, which I have to say, having done a number of proposal processes over the last few years, we had such an incredible volume of high quality submissions. It was a very difficult decision to make. But we were very lucky in the end to have landed with Danilo and Gail, and they helped provide incredible guidance on approaching this project in a good way throughout the entire process. So, okay, so I'll let you decide who wants to talk about what, but I've got a few questions here, and please feel free to jump back and forth and whatever makes sense. But first of all, for the people on the call or on this webinar who would not be familiar with the guideline, wondering if you could just give us an overview about what the guideline is and how it was developed.
Sure. So I think we'll
Go ahead.
I think we'll start off with how the guideline was developed before we jump into what's actually in it.
Sure.
The process was Indigenous led, and we felt it was very important to be able to model the kind of engagement that we were actually talking about within the guideline. So we hosted regional gatherings and national gatherings, and that was very important because we needed to acknowledge and honor that there's a diversity of Indigenous peoples across Canada, and what you have in one part of the country or one part of the province isn't necessarily the same needs as a nation in a different part. So that's why we ended up having the 3 regional talking circles and 2 national talking circles. And we incorporated a lot of Indigenous protocols, some from my teachings, some from Danilo's, and some from the regions that we were actually participating in. One of the main consistent ones that we had was Elder Norman Mead. He was an integral part of the talking circles. He was present at every single regional gathering and national gathering. He would open us up with some words of wisdom, ground us in prayer, ground us in culture before we dove into the work. And talking circles are very unique, and they create a space, a safe space for people to listen and to share. And those were the 2 main important things that we were trying to gather from our engagement sessions. So we were very intentional with the invitation list. We would invite Indigenous engineers, people from Engineers Canada, Elder Norman Mead, and community, Indigenous community members to participate in this, in the talking circles. And another big part of the talking circles was that it takes time because you're listening and you're sharing with other people. And we would have quite a bit of sharing and a lot of truth telling actually in the talking circles. So yeah, we really modeled the engagement that we were suggesting that happens, that's within the guideline. Maybe I'll pass it over to Danilo. I may think of a couple of other things that went into
Good
how
jump
it
in.
was developed.
I think maybe I'll highlight, we were in COVID at the time, and we were really conflicted about, in person versus, wanting to have it in person.
Yeah.
And looking back at it in hindsight, having it virtual really did allow, people from remote locations to come. And I think that it would have been a little different if we had relied solely on in-person engagements, because they likely would have really biased input from people closer to large centers. So looking back, as disappointing as that was, it also allowed the convenience and economy of bringing people from different spaces. And I think that was rewarding for us to be able to engage with folks who we otherwise wouldn't have.
Just a note about the virtual. The virtual worked because everybody was virtual. I don't think it would have worked as well if it was like a hybrid where you would have like small groups of people together in one room. So yeah, I think it needs to be one or the other.
Yeah, and we had conversations really early with you, Ryan, and other staff at Engineers Canada about the scope of the engagement. And that was a change from, I think, the RFP, in the sense of that, we recognized that we needed to increase how we engaged. And we did try to strike a balance between intimate sessions that created an opportunity for people to establish trust so that they could share in an open and honest, sincere way. And so we looked at, could we, sure, we could have shorter ones with more people, but then you would end up with something where you're not really sure what you're gathering. And some of the sharing circles were smaller than I had hoped for. But at the same time, I am in touch with some of those people to this day, because, we created, we came together for a common purpose. We engaged in a really authentic way. And, and I think as a starting point, that was really critical to kind of gaining some really deep insights.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, from my point of view, one of the challenges can be that in certain rooms, big voices kind of take over and do all the talking, right? And the talking circle format, I learned a lot from being able to participate in that. We were able to get people who wouldn't necessarily have felt comfortable, jumping in and giving their comments throughout. People were allowed to pass and then come back and kind of pause. So there were a number of ways in which, I felt that there was some good learning there. And I did feel also that, we have applied similar ideas now more extensively. So when we talk about, kind of indigenization of organizations, this is one of the small ways in which I think Engineers Canada learned a lot from this process.
Okay. And maybe I know folks are probably, if they haven't looked at the guideline, they're probably keen to get a sense of like what's actually in it. And obviously we don't have time to dive into like granular detail, but I'll just give you the kind of the high level overview of what the guideline contains. We struggled with creating a background primer on like establishing the motivations, going all the way back to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the calls to action, the calls for justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Like these are all very informative and kind of drive this work. But we tried to make a link between engineering profession as well. As Sam mentioned, we have a history with the First Peoples of this country, and and there's a relationship to improve and in some ways begin again. So we try to establish that, and we touch on some topics like free, prior, and informed consent at a very early stage. As it evolves, the safety, security, and the benefits to Indigenous women and girls. We address that, and really as a primer to kind of set the stage. The guidelines broken down into 4 principles. And the first one being individual and organizational preparation, kind of breaking down like what can engineers and engineering firms do before you even reach out. So there's a lot of personal and organizational preparation that can be done, and then project specific preparation that can be done. So we go into that. There's pre-engagement learning, like as I just mentioned, this is before you reach out to reduce the barrier or the burden on communities to do your homework. Sources for that information, and even things to consider before you reach out. And then there's a whole section on principles of respectful engagement, and there's a series of building trust, engagement timing, resourcing the engagement, effective communications, and then observing Indigenous protocols, which is, there's so much diversity within that. The last section is around creating an engagement plan, and we really kind of pushed back against creating a checklist and emphasizing the fact that this is a process that is developed, community specific, not cookie cutter, and requires in some cases a deeper understanding of the people you're working with. Now, we also, at the end of this guideline, where there's an appendices that include a number of resources that go beyond a glossary. You know, it really are a number of different types of learning resources aimed at individuals and organizations, and in some cases could and really meant to meet people where they're at. You know, that was a big thing I think about this guideline. I think we can all agree is people bring different strengths and histories and lived experience to it. And just as the end reader is also going to be very diverse, and so we really had to make something that was accessible, but also had content for those experienced practitioners who have worked with Indigenous communities for maybe decades, right? So we feel like there's that's contained in the guideline, and the additional resources really allow someone to dive deeper, and includes not just technical information like on the duty to consult or working with elders, but it also has like information like to get you on your learning journey, maybe including the arts as well, fiction, nonfiction writers. It's really meant to be a gateway to a lifelong of a life worth of learning. So that's kind of the framework of the guideline in its essence.
Interesting. I mean, one thing that that I learned as this process was unfolding was just the idea of reconciliation. I think that reconciliation maybe sounds good to engineers, an engineering ear, it's solution, right? You get there. But one thing that I definitely saw and, kind of continue to experience as having gone through this work is just that reconciliation is an ongoing thing that is, continuously, and new things, come to light, and you learn new things. And so it's almost a mindset for continued engagement and thinking through longer term and that. So, yeah. Okay. So what was your, I guess I'd like to know just a bit about your experience consulting for Engineers Canada and collaborating with Indigenous folks during the development of the guideline. I know you sort of touched on this in a variety of ways already, but what was that like from your point of view? I'm very curious to hear.
For me, it was, as I stated before, one of my favorite projects that I've had, especially at the time. What I found really enjoyable about it was the actual collaboration that we got to do. We started collaborating very early on into the project, and there's like a reciprocity of knowledge sharing. Like, I heard so many times after the talking circles and stuff, I've never done that before, and I've been learning a lot. I also got to learn throughout this project, and it's very meaningful for me. And it helps me out with my future work. I really enjoyed being able to collaborate with the folks that we were inviting to the regional talking circles and to the regional gatherings.
Okay, so I guess just one more question from Urban Systems before we finally get to you, Connor. You've been waiting so patiently. But so, thinking about the overall project, kind of, all the kind of work that was done in this area, and with this large group of people that was involved with it. From your point of view, what worked well and what could be improved? Those famous project end type questions.
I've given this lots of thought, and I always wanted more engagement, and there's a balance to be struck between the intimacy and the quality of that engagement versus the sheer number of perspectives you can include. And you know, we also have to balance that against the realism of a project budget. And you know, we can't engage for years, right? We do need to create something that people can actually start to use, and knowing that we can iterate and improve it as the relationship changes and as legislation and policy evolves over time. So the engagement, I would say in a very simplistic way, I would love to have done more engagement, but and how we can improve that. You know, I've given that some thought too. You know, we've talked about how this guideline has to evolve to reflect, you know, current politics and the sovereignty of nations as they are able to assert their Indigenous legal orders and governance within their territories. So, you know, there's people who are starting to engage with this guideline, use it, likely finding ways that it can be improved. And I really encourage people to not only use it, but to view it critically, right? We need to improve this over time. And as much as we're proud of this, we know that the next iteration is going to have improvement. So between now and when that next iteration is initiated, we should really look at how the engagement can be continued, and really even the audience today, as you start to use it, interact with it, and share the guideline, you know, as an Engineers Canada being the holding that responsibility of the relationship, you know, to be able to gather that information so that the next time we revisit this guideline, you know, we have a body of data essentially from how people have interacted with it and used it maybe. And I really can't help but think that over time communities will find it useful in ways, and we should be really looking at how the next version can even further be a tool for communities to provide input for consultants who are working in their territories. So that's where I saw areas for improvement, and I also think there's areas that we already know how we can do it better.
For me,
oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
For me, the virtual engagements worked really well, as I said earlier, because everybody was virtual. But I really do think it's very important to have in-person engagements, in-person gatherings and talking circles. Because that really goes deep into like the relationship building with the Indigenous communities, and being able to be like in the same space. You can like read body language a little bit more, tone. So yeah, in-person gatherings, I think in the future, outside of COVID.
Yeah. That was the thing.
We'll
right?
add to it. And yeah, just to reiterate what Danila was saying, that it's a living document, and hopefully that it changes for each nation. And yeah.
Yeah, I think that it was really interesting. There was a lot of feedback, not specifically about the content of the guideline we heard, but also just about how it's communicated, how it gets used, who can share it. You know, we had, you know, suggestions that, you know, Indigenous artists be engaged and involved with the work. And we have, in the humble way that was, you know, you talk about project scope and budget, but we have engaged, you know, an Indigenous designer to help with some of our promotions work, and people would have seen that, you know, in Canada's webinar. But absolutely, you know, that question of like a deeper ongoing engagement about what the kind of ideal state, and really starting from that ideal state, you know, when we do think about future iterations of the project, it's a really good point. So thank you, both of you. Okay, so then turning to Connor, as I mentioned in the introduction, you know, the Engineers Canada's Indigenous Advisory Committee did play a critical role in providing guidance in initiating the project, and then in providing some support and, you know, consultation as the guideline was developed. So as the liaison to that committee then, and as member of the QB's practice committee during the project, you had a very important role to play in this project. So I'm wondering if you could start just by telling us about your perspective on the project and the Indigenous Advisory Committee's role in its development.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. And in the interest of inclusion, I'll quickly revise the introduction to the Indigenous Advisory Committee. It's a committee of deeply passionate volunteers assembled to provide Engineers Canada in order to, with guidance, to support their strategy on Operational Imperative 9, promoting equity, diversity, and inclusion in the profession. The committee has stood in one form or another for almost 10 years, and it includes both engineers, non-engineers, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people from across the country. So my perspective on the project in general is a sense of optimism. I've worked in industry on partnerships between Indigenous communities and Western-minded companies. And from that experience, I know that even a well-intentioned company can struggle to adapt their culture and mindset to really appreciate the Indigenous worldview. That being said, there are a lot of excellent examples and best practices out there. I think what I am most optimistic for is the potential for both developers and communities to be able to point to this document as a source of common ground. What I see is Engineers Canada taking a step along the reconciliation journey, recognizing that at least some of their privilege has resulted from Canada's history of colonization, and they're trying to return some of that power to communities. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. I mean, such a insightful comments there. You know, I think that was one element that I hope will grow from this guideline is, you know, the question, it is, the official title is the Guideline for Engineers and Engineering Firms on Indigenous Consultation and Engagement. But one thing that was, as part of this, you know, is this guideline could be a way for Indigenous communities to hold, you know, those firms and engineers accountable. And, you know, I think that in the way that it was developed, there's a lot of potential for a kind of using it is a two-way conversation, not just a tool for engineers. So yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you for those comments. So then your experience, kind of personal experience or, you know, higher level experience, you know, what was it like being liaison then between the IAC and the QB Practice Committee?
Yeah, for sure. So regarding that participation, I'll start with the tactics maybe of the committee involvement. So two members of our committee, Nicole McDonald and myself, were brought into the qualification board process and meetings very early on in the process. And we were given, as you said, voting privileges specific to the content of the guideline. Really well received. For us, what that meant is that our committee had a degree of agency beyond simply an advisory capacity. Nicole and I brought the key issues and the guideline drafts back to the broader committee for review and discussion. And kind of what this achieved was a framework where all of the grassroots input from communities and Indigenous engineers from those nationwide sessions, that it would be heard with appropriate weight in those closed door meetings. And maybe phrased slightly differently, there were always people in the decision-making positions who were Indigenous themselves and brought with them those cultural competencies, biases, and worldview. It is the failing of perhaps other structures. So yeah, I think it was highly effective.
Thanks, Connor. And then I guess just the last question then is sort of about your learnings on the project. You know, what did you get out of it personally, professionally, or, you know, from your perspective as an Indigenous engineer?
Yeah, I think so. My main learning actually is I found myself somewhat humbled by the status between engineers and Indigenous peoples in our country from the feedback that we heard and the examples that we saw. So I'll reiterate that we as a group want more input and feedback as this document begins circulation, specifically from communities themselves. An important premise that Danila mentioned that underpinned our discussions was this needs to be a living document, and its best practices improve, legal cases are resolved, and frankly, as the average level of Indigenous awareness among engineers increases, I believe we can go further and expect more from our profession as a whole. There remains within the document a tone of conservatism around the historical harms done by people or agencies in engineering roles. And I'll admit that we struggled finding language that would resonate as truth with our spectrum of target audiences. So in an ideal world, I see this as a starting point of a conversation that brings the worldview of engineers and Indigenous communities closer together. What we don't want is to alienate one party. So if a reader sees room for improvement or feels challenged by certain phrasing, I'd ask that they engage and provide that feedback rather than disengage. I think that's how we stand the best chance of having meaningful impact on how engineers, companies, and Indigenous peoples relate to each other in this country via what is effectively a document. Yeah.
Yeah, we definitely, I think that overall, the feedback I sort of, play this role of shuttling information back and forth among various groups. But, overall, I think that there was a sense of positivity that the work was being undertaken. But we also heard some very, pointed and direct feedback throughout this process from all sides of the topic. And I think that coming to terms with those moments where things get very uncomfortable, for anybody, this is the way that you test the mettle of a work, it becomes stronger. So I think that was a really important process. I wholeheartedly agree that definitely wanting to hear about people's experiences engaging with this guideline and ways that it can be improved or gaps or where do we go from here. So yeah, thanks, Connor. Okay, now I'm going to turn back to you, Sam. So the guideline is available as a resource, but to take steps towards a better future for engineering, it's important for engineers to understand how to incorporate the principles that are laid out in the guideline in their work. So Sam, as a practicing engineer, what are some of the practical steps that engineers and organizations can take to effectively integrate the guidelines principles into their existing practices and projects?
Thank you, Ryan. So again, the guideline itself is it's meant to offer engineers and engineering firms who interact with our Indigenous communities the real guidance in preparing for and planning the engagements and observing the Indigenous protocols and meeting the project needs and the community needs. So I think what we see is this guideline presents a great principles that really lead to successful engagement. And Danilo, you mentioned these, and they are definitely in the guideline. You mentioned the individual and organizational preparation, the pre-engagement learning, principles of respectful engagement, and creating an effective engagement plan. Now, while some communities and organizations, establish their own engagement protocols and best practices, some Indigenous communities and engineering stakeholders can truly use this guideline as a foundation for an individualized, a tailored approach to engagement.
Thank you, Sam. And we will pop over to you now, Connor, also a practicing engineer. So, as engineers begin the process of implementing the guidelines practices in their work, what do you think some of the potential challenges engineers might face, as they start to use this guideline, and how could they overcome them?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to beat around the bush on this question, and I'll kind of use a bit of not an extended metaphor, but almost an extended example of what I saw in my experiences. Because in my mind, many of the challenges arise because of a perceived difference in worldview when it doesn't need to be there, perhaps. So on one side, there's usually an engineer, most likely representing a consultancy or a client, and they've been given a very Western, discrete schedule to achieve milestones and complete the project with maximizing profit. And in many cases, the engineer has limited influence or control on the broader schedule, and that schedule is frequently already behind when they start, creating a pronounced sense of urgency and maybe even immediacy. And then, as Elder Norman kind of described on the other side, there's a community, people with knowledge, interests, strong set of values, Indigenous or otherwise. They're inherently reasonable people who make decisions based on the best interests of their community. And what our current system allows is friction to emerge because we smash these worldviews together. Engineers are permitted to inform the community of projects specifics only after many of the path dependencies have been decided. The logic we use is confidentiality or internal approvals or constraints governing. Those are constraints that govern the behavior. So when a community first sees a development proposal, there's often little or no room for actual change without substantial costs. And the status quo of engagement is set up for displeasure because of that. It relies on one party enforcing its legal rights on the other to get what they need from what should be a partnership, whether those be regulatory approvals, land rights, etc. So what we hope for going forward is kind of the disassembly of these norms. Engagement as a relationship involves both authenticity and time. If you're an organization with any kind of development arm, you ought to know with some accuracy which areas of the world you're likely to work in. And if you want the best outcomes for your projects, you should be proactively learning about those people, like their goals, values, interests, the homework that Danilo mentioned. You should be equally transparent about your own goals, values, and interests. If your company is driven by shareholder primacy and all you care about is money, just tell them, and maybe you'll be guided. Again, early guidance is key. Similarly, you should know in general what engagement means to that community and how long it will take to make each party feel heard. But most importantly, you should have the mutual trust to include the community at the onset of the opportunity, when there's actually room for feedback to be heard and implemented. So I'll give one example, being from Calgary. The events that happen around Stampede, maybe as an analogy. Western companies have no trouble spending time, money, resources to host a big party with their leaders and key personnel, as well as the leaders and key personnel of their partner companies. They do it because they want to get to know the people behind the logo, put a face to a name, meet the people who are important to those people. And I think it's easier in this context because there's an expectation of mutual financial benefit, a lot of Western norms that make doing this with alcohol kind of a low risk engagement opportunity. But if we can achieve just a subtle shift in worldview and have those same people invest the same time and energy attending social events that are important to the Indigenous communities where they work and live, I believe that we can make projects have a higher value, whether it's economic or otherwise, and perhaps chip into the issue of reconciliation bit by bit. So my challenge is, whoever you are reading this document, escalate it up your leadership chain. Have your leaders actually read it and contemplate how they could lay the groundwork for this kind of relationship building, engagement, and not just what is legally binding consultation. And I bet money that endeavoring to implement even a few Indigenous values into your business model will actually result in improved long-term outcomes, even among a Western measure of success. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Connor. Okay, wow, so much to process. And rather than, me saying anything, I would like to now turn it over to the full group. So you have my sincerest gratitude. Thank you, everyone, for sharing all of your knowledge and insights today. It's it continues to be this just absolutely mind-blowing experience. So thank you so much. So a big question then for everyone, and we'll start with Elder Norman. So having contributed to this guideline over the past several years, I'm wondering what your biggest surprise or learning has been.
Well, there are no really big surprises that I can think of right off the top of my head, but one of the things that I look forward to is that when we talk about indigenizing and we talk about decolonizing what we're working with here, and they're not one and the same, not at all. Indigenizing, it's going to take us, and in the words of Black Elk as a prophet, and that philosophy that it will take 7 generations, and that's going to take 7 generations, might mean 100, 140, 150 years to see the results of what we had put in today. Of course, in that many years, none of us are sitting here, right? But our children and our grandchildren and the unborn child will hopefully see the work that we have put into this. And I know for myself, I'm hoping that we will, that the surprises might not be our surprises so much, but hopefully our unborn children will be surprised at how much work and thought went into this. Because sustainability, as we know, the world must sustain itself, and if it doesn't, it's because we haven't done our work very, very good as as engineers, as company officials, as elders, as we need to do more. And the one thing that I would want to say for sure is that we need to do more praying and more ceremonial things about the work that we do. We have to do that because we can't ask for blessings on what the work we do and to realize it if we don't ourselves acknowledge that the Creator had put us here in this garden to take care of it, not to destroy it.
Thank you, Elder Norman. Maybe we'll jump to Gail next.
Thank you. For me, I was pleasantly surprised and I was actually very honored to be able to witness like actual like growth with the people that we were working with. So in quite a few of the engagement sessions, some people got to move along and we engaged with people multiple times. And just to witness that growth around knowledge around Indigenous communities, Indigenous protocols, truth and reconciliation, it was really inspiring. And it, like, you know, that's what I hold on to. It's just like, okay, we're actually getting somewhere. And I think that's very important. And so I am very honored that I got to witness that.
Thanks, Gail. Maybe since you're next on my screen, we'll go to Sam.
All right. Well, I have a learning and a surprise, so maybe I can share both. I thought it was an amazing journey, and I learned a lot from how, you know, the process of putting the guideline together through the development, and how urban systems really looked into the data gathering, you know, and the guidelines direction and undertaking of the writing itself of the guideline. Again, we're very also fortunate, and I want to make sure we mention that working with our Indigenous Advisory Committee, really the members really provided a lot of important insight and real proven guidance, I think, to the practice committee and in the development of this guideline. Now, one thing that also I learned that there's really a real diversity, I guess, in Indigenous perspectives. And this is in Canada, and also by looking at how many industries are involved with Indigenous consultation and engagement. I really like how urban systems focused on a principle-based approach. I think they assembled a very experienced panel members and all the participants through the gatherings and the workshops. And really, that was very important to get the input that was required for this guideline. Now, for the surprise, I really learned that there's a big difference between consultation and engagement. In my day-to-day work, I guess public consultations or environmental assessments really is a little bit different. But I thought that I learned a lot more about the engagement. So even though they go often hand in hand, engagement and consultation, the key differences really is stark. It's important to note. I learned that engagement needs to happen early, often, and needs to be ongoing. Engagement really builds that strong relationships that really are important with our Indigenous communities, exchanging information, and really the purpose of the engagement is to build trust, and that was mentioned before, and creating those meaningful relationships. Again, I see everything as a journey and not a one-time thing, so that's the key. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Okay, I have Connor next on my screen here. So Connor.
Yeah, learning, awakening, whatever you want to call it, of the kind of past few years of my involvement with the Indigenous Advisory Committee and this project as well, is perhaps the size of the ecosystem of allies you have when embarking on this journey. It might be easy if you work for maybe a small development shop, a small consultancy, don't know where to look or where to go. But from our group's national input sessions, there's a ton of work happening in universities, in companies, at NGOs, at regulator levels. And all you have is to reach out and find one node of the matrix, and you'll get a flood of input and support, I think is maybe the takeaway for people as they're maybe not sure where to start, or something in the document really surprised them. And there's a wonderful set of resources and wonderful set of agencies that Urban System has put together. So I think that's my bid for hope is just you're not alone on this journey. Yeah.
Thanks, Connor. And last but not least, Danilo.
Wow, you know, I enjoyed all those responses, and I could, you know, they resonated with me very personally, actually. And one thing I'll add, and I think it kind of builds, is as Connor mentioned, you know, we had to find a balance in some circumstances. And one of the surprises coming into this, or coming out of it, I guess, was the level of not seriousness, but there was a a sincere engagement around finding that balance. And there was a couple conversations about some terminology and some language that, you know, we really leaned on the Indigenous Advisory Committee, and there was just such a there was different perspectives brought in, but within the process, you know, we found that balance. And I'm not sure why that's surprising to me, but I was really encouraged by the willingness to be uncomfortable and to assert your opinion, and to find folks who are willing to listen and learn. Coming out of it, you know, it really gave me like and again, like Connor was saying about like the depth of support. And I've been really fortunate actually just to be on the receiving end of communications from people who have followed up with questions or inquiries. And some people inquiring like, when is this going to be ready? And this is, you know, because they were really invested. And I just and that was a surprise to me, because you know, you never know if you're working on your own in a silo, just kind of plugging away, or, you know, if there's anyone out there. And there are people out there.
Most definitely. All right, thank you, everyone. So I have one final question for everybody here today. So my last big question is, what hopes do you have for the broader impact of the guideline on the future of engineering and on the relationship with Indigenous communities? And we'll follow my order again here. And Elder Norman, we'll finish with you this time. So Gail, you're first on my list. So.
I'm really excited to see where this actually goes, and for it to be like individualized for each of the communities. I really hope it can like build confidence and capacity in people who are engaging and consulting with Indigenous communities. The relationship part of it is the most important. So I'm looking forward to seeing that blossom all over the country.
Me too. Sam, your thoughts on this one?
Well, I think my message is I really hope the guideline will be really widely used and truly serving sort of to improve and strengthen the relationship with our Indigenous communities across Canada. I really know it will. And I want to say thank you to all the hard work that everybody on this panel, and Ryan, you as well. Thank you.
Hey, Connor.
Yeah, I think so. I'll start with the statement that I have genuine faith that the average or most engineers have societal service at the core of what they do. It's a profession that wants to do good and do better. So my hope is that this document gives those people the tools to have engineering play a leadership role in our society's progress towards reconciliation, rather than a laggard or a follower. You know, that's a big goal, but we're one step closer now. Yeah.
Thanks. Danilo.
One thing I'll add, I guess, is I really hope that current and future engineers are, through this guideline, but also through, you know, improvements in curriculum, decolonization and indigenization of curriculum, professional development, you know, beyond the guideline, and whatever supporting resources are realized in the future, you know, that engineers can more comfortably and gain competence in navigating our shared history of incorporating Indigenous protocols within their engagement, and then eventually incorporating Indigenous principles in design. So I really hope that that this serves that purpose in a small measure, combined with a lot of other initiatives. That's my hope, is that, and you know, there's a lot of implications for intercultural collaboration that go beyond the engineers in Canada. Many of the people here today are going to work with Indigenous communities. They're also going to work abroad, and they're going to need to navigate other worldviews. And I think that it's just a competency I'm hoping that current and future engineers can develop.
Thanks, Danilo. Hey. And I saved you for last, Elder Norman. For you, from your perspective, the hopes for the broader impact of the guideline on the future of engineering and relationships with engineering, with Indigenous communities.
Yeah, well, I like to think, and I mentioned the word sustainability, and I think we all have a role to play in that. Engineers have a big role to play in that sustainability. What was ours, Indigenous thought was ours. It didn't belong to ours in the way that we thought it, that the way that it would be thought about today, like in the colonized way, that we thought about it as a gift from Creator. That was ours. When we think about what became theirs meaning the world of which we are, of which we live today. In my way of thinking, sustainability means that it's ours, it became theirs, it might have reverted somewhat back to what we would say is ours, hopefully, but it really belongs to yours. Yours meaning our children and our great-children, our great-grandchildren, and our unborn children. That's what it means to me. And I think I would wrap up my thoughts in that way. Sustainability means that it comes in that order almost. What was ours becomes theirs, and what became theirs reverts back to becoming ours now. But really, sustainability means that we want to see something for our children, our children's children, and our unborn children.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time today. You have my heartfelt gratitude, and I really appreciate your thoughtful responses. And tell just how much consideration went into everybody's thoughts today. So thank you so much for this. I also want to thank our viewers for your interest in this guideline and the topics that it covers. So we hope this webinar has been of use and has provided some practical considerations for your future projects. I encourage everyone to engage further with the guideline, and you can find that on our website, and continue your learning, engaging, and promoting understanding of Indigenous peoples in the engineering communities. Before you go, if you register for this webinar, you will receive a webinar feedback survey by email. So if you're watching the recorded version, please find a link to the survey in the description box. And please share your comments and feedback to help us improve our future webinars. Chi miigwech, and goodbye, everyone.